Hello and welcome to this video where we're starting a series on the problem of evil. Today we're starting off with the logical problem of evil, and we're going to be introducing you to what it is, its goals, and also how it has developed over time. So first of all, what is the logical problem of evil? Unlike the evidential problem of evil or the pastoral existential problem of evil, the logical problem of evil attempts to demonstrate the incompatibility between God and evil. It is an a priori argument, which means that instead of relying on evidence or experience, it is attempting to, via pure reason alone, demonstrate the formal inconsistency of the two ideas. To illustrate, imagine I have this pin and I have this handle. If you're looking at this from an a posteriori argument or an inductive argument, you may, for example, look at this and say, well, from my experience, it is most likely that these two things cannot exist at the same time. Assume the handle or this pin is evil and this handle is God. You might say, well, it might be unlikely for both of these to exist in the same world, but they could exist. The logical problem of evil, however, says something completely different. It's not saying, well, due to my experience, there might be some inconsistency or there might be some problem with this. It is saying that based on reason alone, evil and God are completely inconsistent and cannot exist in the same world. So if the pin exists, then that means a handle cannot exist. If the handle exists, that means the pin cannot exist. So that is the approach of the logical problem of evil. That's why people call it the a priori argument. That's why people call it the deductive argument. Because if the premises of the argument work, then it follows from those premises that the conclusion must hold. So with that in mind about what the logical problem of evil is, what are some of the formulations of the logical problem of evil? The logical problem of evil is originally attributed by Hume to Epicurus, who comes along with this banger of a phrase which says, evil can only be explained by a non-all-powerful God, or can only be explained by a God who wasn't good enough to think that evil was worth eliminating. So as you can see from this original presentation, what Epicurus is arguing, or at least what Hume is attributing to Epicurus, who is arguing, is saying that either God cannot be all good because then evil would not exist, or he cannot be all powerful because if he was all powerful, he would eradicate that evil. So as a result, what is being presented here is not something based on, well, all right, there might be evil or there might not be a God, or these things are somewhat improbable if put together, but rather he's just saying, well, all right, if evil exists, then one of these properties that we normally attribute to God is incorrect. So if we're going to formalize it a bit more, we could put it in a proof from contradiction. So the proof of contradiction could come along the lines of something like this. So premise 1, God is all good and all powerful. Premise 2, if God is all good and all powerful, then evil would not exist. Premise 3, evil exists. Therefore, premise 4, via modus tollens, you would say God is not all good and all powerful, but since 1 and 4 are contradictory because you can't have the proposition God is all good and all powerful alongside the proposition that God is not all good and not all powerful, then you have a contradiction, hence God does not exist. That would be the proof from contradiction, which would be presented from Hume's or Epicurus's argument. However, a lot of philosophers have looked at that and said, well, such a presentation is not strong enough. In some sense, yes, you could say those arguments seem to follow from each other. However, they don't follow completely. There seems to be an area where you don't really get exactly from the first premises that God is all good and all powerful to the idea that then evil will not exist. That seems somewhat unjustified, at least in a modus ponens sense. It doesn't seem to exactly follow in an a priori sense. Of course, a posteriori, someone who might have an experience of God might say, well, the God that I experience might not allow for evil to exist, but that is kind of separate from the a priori situation, the pre-experience situation. So as a result, an Australian philosopher called J.L. Mackie comes up with the idea that there has to be one additional premise added to that argument. So instead of going through those arguments just as from 1 to 5, he then adds an extra premise which says, if something is good, they would try to eliminate evil at all possible situations. And if you grant that premise, so I'll put that up on the screen again, then it would seem to follow that now you have a deductively valid argument such that if every single premise is correct, then that means the conclusion must follow that God does not exist. So you then notice that we have two distinct formulations of the problem of evil, or the logical problem of evil, which if the premises hold, then the conclusion must follow. So if you've been enjoying this video so far and want to learn more or see my notes on this video, then check out www.josh-yen.com. I'll put a link to that in the description below so you can go check it out. And also, if you do enjoy this video and want to stay tuned to the next videos on this channel where we're going to be covering other aspects of the problem of evil, then make sure to like and subscribe and also hit the bell notification so you stay up to date with all the uploads. But those are not the only formulations of the problem of evil. Another formulation or approach to the logical problem of evil is not to say that God and evil is intrinsically inconsistent. What they might say, however, is that God and a specific form of evil is inconsistent. So while the previous argument that we're talking about, the generic form or Mackey's form, is talking about the big concept of evil, no evil can exist, another formulation could say, well, yes, some evil can exist logically with God, but at the same time, certain specific evils might not be able to exist. So, for example, an idea of this or a reformulation of this might be, let's just take, for example, the Holocaust. And you might say, well, all right, God is all good and all powerful. If God is all good and all powerful, the Holocaust would not exist. And of course, you'll add the Mackey's contribution by saying an all good and all powerful being would remove the Holocaust in every possible world. The Holocaust existed, and then of course the argument would then follow as such. Now, of course, this argument is a bit different, so that would mean that a response to that new formulation of the problem of evil is not a direct response to the prior formulation, but rather, instead of just saying, well, okay, there could be one possible world, and of course this is a spoiler of the free will defense, but there is, instead of responding by just saying, well, there is one possible world in which evil and God exist in the same time, what you now need to say is there is one possible world in which that specific type of evil coexists with that specific God in a possible world. So as you can see, the argument is formulated a bit different. Now, with that in mind, let's move on to the final part of this video, which I want to stress that the logical problem of evil should not be conflated with the pastoral problem of evil, in the sense that what we're talking about here is purely conceptual. When I'm talking about evil, when I'm talking about God, I'm not talking about these from a personal landscape. I'm not talking about an individual's religious experience with God, and I'm not talking about someone's individual experience with evil. For example, if someone's child dies of cancer or whatever, things like that, or maybe the Holocaust happens and I'm talking to a Jew who's just escaped Auschwitz or something like that, I'm not going to be saying, all right, we're going to be talking about your evil as a conceptual, impersonal problem in comparison to your worldview that you're experiencing right now, or the situations you're experiencing right now. I'm not caring about that side of the thing, although it's important that we recognize it. It's also important to recognize that when we're talking about the logical problem of evil, the proponent, a theologian, is not responding or presenting a case of emotions or personal experience. They're merely talking about these as conceptual ideas. Can the abstract evil be coexisting with an abstract kind of God? Is that possible? In that sense, it's a priori, it's deductive. It's not based on our current experiences or our personal relationships with evil or God. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the evidential problem of evil. In the last video, we talked about the logical problem of evil and how evil, according to the proponents of the logical problem of evil, is logically inconsistent with the existence of God. Today, we're talking about another variation of the problem of evil, which can be summarized as evil makes it highly unlikely that God exists. So instead of arguing from an a priori deductive manner, this is an a posteriori argument. They're relying on things like probability and an experience of the reality of evil to argue for the inexistence or the improbability of the existence of God. So to summarize this argument, I'd like to turn to a statement made by William Rowe. So he writes, suppose in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. So far as we can see, the fawn's intense suffering is pointless, for there does not appear to be any greater good such that the prevention of the fawn's suffering would require either the loss of that good or the occurrence of an evil equally bad or worse. This argument used by William Rowe is quite a good example of how evidential problem of evils work. As you can see, instead of arguing for an intrinsic property, or at least why certain realities of evil can be inconsistent with certain realities or properties of God, what this argument is just saying is to try to illustrate and elaborate upon that intuitive improbability between the existence of God and the existence of evil.
As a result, when you're talking to people about the evidential problem of evil, the response you're making is less so about redefining their conception of God or redefining possible conceptions of evil to find a possible world or a possible framework under which God and evil coexist. Responses to this have to come under a lens to make that intuitive tension disappear, or at least ease that prima facie intuitive tension between the existence of God and evil. Now, the reason why I'm saying intuitive tension is because this is a fundamentally probabilistic argument. For this to hold watertight, it's very important for the atheists to try to raise a form of calculations of actual improbabilities of how evil and God don't exist together. The reason for why it's important for them to have actual mathematical probabilities is because fundamentally when you're raising probabilities, there are a few different types of improbabilities. There's mathematical probabilities, which we all know. For example, if you have a complete fair coin, the mathematical probability is 50% on each side. However, if you're looking at this from the perspective of, well, all right, this seems unlikely, but I'm not sure exactly how unlikely it is, you fall into the realm of intuitive probability. But of course, that's heavily determined by psychological upbringing, cultural differences. For example, someone's belief of how unlikely it is for their friend to bow to their elders when they're meeting them for the first time might be different from when you're talking to a Japanese person, where bowing is a very strong part of the culture, to an American, where people normally shake their hands on their first meeting. As a result, you can see that clear differences between intuitive probability and mathematical probability occur. And as a result, I believe a lot of the problems and discussions within the evidential problem of evil do arise because a lot of the times, while it seems improbable that God and evil coexist, they are indeed talking about intuitive probability instead of mathematical probability. With that distinction in mind, I would like to talk about three categorical distinctions which exist in the evidential problem of evil: the gratuitous versus the non-gratuitous distinction, the moral versus natural evil distinction, and the categorical and the deontological approach to morality and the consequentialist approach to morality. Now, these distinctions might not be directly applied to the evidential problem of evil, but there are important elements of discussion surrounding problems of evils in general, so I think this is a very good place in which it can be inputted into our introductory series to the logical problem of evil. When we're talking about gratuitous versus non-gratuitous evil, this is the question of, are there evils which do not have reason for? Gratuitous evil is the idea that there exists evils which there are no reasons for. Evil just exists as a certain idea, as a certain concept, or as a certain reality in the world with no explanation for. A good example of this would be turning back to that example of a deer in a forest raised by William Rowe at the start of this video. We're talking about that deer which dies for no apparent reason at all. It's the kid who dies from cancer towards no greater good at all. Non-gratuitous evil is the idea that there exists evil, but those evils have explanations. For example, if I'm giving my friend or my cousin a vaccination, they're getting a vaccination to develop their health in the long run. And that is, as a result, non-gratuitous evil. So as you can see, each different types of evil, each different type of situations would lead to different probabilities of the existence of God, at least intuitively. For example, if all evil in this world was non-gratuitous, that means there are reasons for why those evils exist. Then there will be good reason to suggest that that evil might not be a very strong argument against the existence of God. On the other hand, if you do accept the idea that evil, or at least gratuitous evil, exists, then you might be thinking, well, actually, why does God allow for evil which has no intrinsic purpose at all, or has no actual cause and effect, which leads to positive outcomes in the future? Does that decrease the probability of God's existence? Those are things which the proponent of the evidential problem of evil would be arguing for. So if you're enjoying this video so far, then feel free to like and subscribe. And also, if you have any questions about anything in this video, let me know in the comments below. I'll happily tend to them there. Furthermore, if you want to support this channel financially, then go check out our Patreon or our YouTube membership. These are two places which will help me make my mission of spreading free and accessible content to the world in an affordable and more sustainable fashion. With that in mind, let's carry on with the video. Now, the second distinction is the distinction between moral and natural evil. The difference between moral and natural evil is quite a clear one. For example, the Holocaust, that was caused by the evil actions and decisions of people like Adolf Hitler and the SS. However, when you're talking about natural evil, you're talking about earthquakes, you're talking about things like tsunamis. These are suffering, natural disasters, which do not seem to be a result of any moral agents. And as a result, you might say, well, okay, the free will theodicy, the free will defense, might work against certain types of evils, for example, the moral types of evils, but it will not work against the natural types of evil. So as a result, the proponents of the evidential problem of evil might be saying, well, okay, look, I accept that it's probable that God exists alongside evil in those cases of moral evil. However, the world we live in today is a world filled with moral and natural evil. Okay, theist, you can explain the moral evil, but you cannot explain the natural evil. Explain to me, theist, why does there exist God, or why is it probable that God exists when there is natural evil? So that is another challenge in which the evidential evil can be developed towards. Now, finally, there's a discussion between the consequentialist theories and the deontological and categorical distinctions of moral ethical theories. Now, why do I raise this conception of moral theories and virtue? Well, the reason for why I raise this is because it will fundamentally dictate how you are presenting these arguments and also how you can respond to it. If we are accepting a consequentialist framework, then you bring back the non-gratuitous evil and say, well, okay, yes, as long as the theist can provide certain goods which can potentially, might not actually come about, but can potentially come out as a result of that evil, then maybe you can justify it. However, if you're looking at it from a purely categorical landscape, if you're looking at it from a sense of deontology, you might then say, well, all right, regardless of what good comes out of this in the future, the fact that evil exists in the first place is a failure of duty on behalf of God. God cannot just say, well, all right, I'm going to put evil in someone's life just so that good can come out in the future. Categorically speaking, evil is bad, and therefore one must wrestle with the question of evil and God from a categorical landscape. So as you can see, there's a very clear distinction which is made when you're approaching this from a categorical landscape and when you're approaching this from an evidential landscape. So by understanding these three distinctions of the problem of evil, I believe we can have a further understanding of the evidential problem of evil and important distinctions that we have to be aware of when we're entering into this discussion about the problem of evil, both from the atheistic side and also the theistic side.
In this video, we're continuing our series on the problem of evil, and we're talking about the existential problem of evil. This is a problem of evil which is less developed in literature and also less discussed on YouTube, but it's a very important discussion to bear in mind. So today we're going to be talking about the existential problem of evil, how it differs from the logical and evidential problem of evil that we've talked before in this series, and also discuss the merits of this argument. So the first thing that we're thinking about the existential problem of evil is the distinction between conceptual problems of evil and logical and practical problems of evil. So the distinction between conceptual and practical is actually a very important distinction in philosophy. A good example of this, to just illustrate this distinction, is the idea of communism. The reason why communism is such a good example of this discussion between the conceptual and the practical is a discussion about their impacts. When we're talking about their impacts, we're thinking about, okay, practically speaking, there was a lot of deaths arisen during the communist periods in both Russia and China in the 20th century. So you could be saying, well, all right, the practical impacts of communism were very big. However, does that mean conceptual discussions cannot be made because of those dangerous practical impacts? Perhaps not. Perhaps someone might say, well, yes, we recognize practically communism is not good. However, conceptually, there's still a lot of value in researching and understanding possible benefits of conceptual discussions surrounding the issue of communism. And by doing that conceptual arithmetic and those conceptual thinking about communism, we are able to understand about, well, perhaps there's things that we can take from communism which are beneficial. But that is, of course, a conceptual discussion. So now that we've talked a bit about the distinction, I think this idea about communism makes it very clear, let's think about how that applies to our existential problem of evil. The existential problem of evil, unlike the logical and evidential problem of evil, is talking about the practical landscape of evil. Instead of talking about the conceptual, which is the logical and the evidential, unlike the logical and evidential problem of evils, which are based on conceptual thinking about evil, the practical realities of evil is more existential. We're thinking about the practical realities of evil and how that existentially impacts our lives. An example of that will be a book by William Styron called Sophie's Choice. In this story, a girl called Sophie has a daughter and a son. The SS guards come up with guns and says, well, all right, you have to choose between your son dying and getting sent to the gas chambers or your daughter dying and getting sent to the gas chambers. The logical problem of evil, we look at that and say, well, that exact variable or that exact situation of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of God. Evidential problem would say it's very unlikely that that example would exist if God exists. What the existential problem with evil does, however, is to say, well, all right, I don't really care about logical inconsistency. I don't really care about logical improbability. But regardless of where I come from, I refuse to accept the existence of God if that example of evil exists. So they're saying, well, I feel that this injustice caused to Sophie is so powerful that I cannot possibly justify a belief in God, regardless of any other philosophical reasoning I have with this. And you might think at start, well, this is just ridiculous. How can someone possibly make this as an argument? But think about it yourself. Don't we all rely on that existential-like thinking? When we're thinking about problems of evil, aren't we all just saying, well, yes, when we're using examples in the discussion surrounding the problem of evil, when we're raising the ideas of murder, the Holocaust, and things, we like to say we're being philosophical about it. We like to say we're being conceptually rigorous about it. The reality is, we really are just saying, actually, personally, I am not comfortable with that reality. I cannot accept that reality. I cannot accept the existence of God given that evil. So, well, let's develop this a bit further. And I think the best example of this illustration is the problem found in Ivan Karamazov, in the Brothers Karamazov. And in this book, Ivan comes up with a wonderful statement which says, it's not God that I don't accept, but it is his ticket I reject. So it's God's ticket. I can't write very well, but it's God's ticket that I reject. Note this distinction here. He is not arguing for atheism. This statement does not lead to atheism. I reject God's ticket. In fact, if you look at it in a nuanced sense, well, what does that actually mean? He's saying God's ticket does exist. He believes in God, but he rejects that ticket. So what is Ivan actually saying in this situation? Ivan Karamazov is not saying he's an atheist. What Ivan Karamazov is saying that I believe in God, he's a theist, but at the same time, he refuses to worship that God. So that, I think, is a development of the existential problem of evil, and I think that's the brilliance of Dostoevsky's nuance surrounding the problem of evil. He's saying, well, hold up. A lot of times when we talk about the problem of evil, we like to compare Dostoevsky and say everything is all about a conceptual problem. It's all about that conceptual problem. The reality, it really isn't. Most of us fall into the practical discussion, the existential discussion. We're saying, well, yeah, God, I recognize you created the universe, but the existence of evil just makes me want to reject your existence. You really want me to believe that you exist? You want me to worship you? Why did you give us so much evil? That is the heart of the existential problem of evil. But now you might be not very convinced, well, what actually is this difference? How can someone be a theist and still not believe in God? Well, the final distinction I would like to talk about in relation to the existential problem of evil is a distinction between belief in and a distinction between belief that. Now, this distinction is something risen in a writer called H.H. Price. Now, you can go check it out yourself later. There was an article about it. It's on JSTOR, a guy called H.H. Price. What this argument is that, well, sometimes belief in and belief that can be put together. For example, if I believe that fairies don't exist, I most likely will not believe in fairies. Now, I'd like to ask you a question, and you could let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What's the difference between belief in and belief that? We've accepted that, and sometimes belief that it has direct implications and entails a certain belief in. However,
if someone believes that God exists, doesn't mean that they believe in God. And what's the differences between that? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, while you're writing your thoughts in the comments below, I'd just like to go away from this lecture a bit and say if you are enjoying this video and want to continue watching these videos, then make sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so you stay updated to these videos. Furthermore, if you would like to support my mission in carrying on providing free and accessible content to the world, then feel free to check out my Patreon or my membership group, Dostoevsky. It really means a lot to me. I really appreciate all the help the Patrons have given me. It helps me make these videos in a sustainable manner and also further help me develop my academia as well. Now that you've had some time to write your thoughts about belief in and unbelief in the comments below, let's talk a bit about distinctions between the two. According to Price, although there are times, as I noted before, that belief in and belief that can be put together, there are also times that belief that does not entail belief in. A good example of that would be the book of James, James chapter 2 to be exact. In James chapter 2, James writes, the epistle of James writes, well, even the demons believe in God, and they tremble. However, they don't worship him. I believe that that is a very example, alongside reading Christ, of the differences between belief in and belief that. Belief that is just a propositional belief. It's what the demons believe. The demons say, yes, 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 I know that God exists. But belief in implies a sense of worshipping God. And this idea of worship versus just a propositional belief is a difference of attitude. What we're talking about, the existential problem of evil, and driving it back to the existential problem of evil, is that existential problem of evil all along is a question of attitude. Question of attitude. It is not about whether God exists or not. It's not a question of how likely does God exist, as you see in the logical or evidential evil. It's a question of, even if God exists, what is our attitude towards God? And that is the significance of the existential problem of evil, and why I think it is perhaps, although the least talked about problem of evil, the most important problem of evil, because this is ultimately where most people lie in the world. Most people don't care about abstract philosophy, most people don't care about logic and all those things. People do care about the attitude. Is God worthy of worship? And that's a question of the existential. In the last 3 videos on this series, we've been talking about the logical, evidential, and existential problem of evil. Now we're moving on to responses to these problems that Christians have presented. The reason why, and the first thing I'd like to be talking about, is the distinction of a defense. Why is this called a defense instead of the theodicy? For those who are interested in the philosophy of religion, you'll have known that responses to the problem of evil are normally called theodicies. However, why is the free will defense called a defense and not a theodicy? The reason is very simple. A theodicy is, as Noter puts it, a way to justify the reasons of God to man. It's saying God has good reasons for allowing evil. But that is not what a defense is trying to do. The defense is written against the logical problem of evil to say that there is one possible world in which God exists and evil exists. Now, why is this significant? Why is it significant that this one possible world is not a theodicy? Well, if we're thinking about the claim that logical problem of evil is making, the logical problem of evil is arguing, well, there are no possible worlds in which God and evil coexist. Therefore, if you provide one possible world in which they exist, that would prove by counterexample that the logical problem of evil doesn't work. So therefore, people who propose a free will defense are attempting not to say, well, God has good reason for evil, or that evil has any reason at all. They're just saying that it is possible, it might not even be this world, but it is possible, definitely, that there is one world in which God and evil coexist. Now, the leading scholar in free will defense is a guy called Alvin Plantinga. He has written 2 books on this topic. One is called Plantinga. There's 2 books he's written on it. One's called The Nature of Necessity, and the other one's called God, Freedom, and Evil. Just in case you want to learn more about free will defense, I recommend you reading God, Freedom, and Evil, just because that is more simple, it's more introduction. The Nature of Necessity is quite complex. Even I found it a bit difficult when I first started reading. But I do recommend you to read those books if you're interested in the free will defense, also the modological argument. But of course, that is higher level philosophy. Nevertheless, when we're thinking about the free will defense, we're talking about Alvin Plantinga, someone who has had a great impact on the world of philosophy, and also is commonly recognized as the person who defeated the logical problem of evil. The free will defense is commonly recognized as a response to the logical problem
evil. Now that we're talking about that one possible world, let's talk a bit about how we get to that one possible world. How do we get a world in which God and evil coexist? Alvin Plantinga argues that this one possible world occurs because of the existence of, as you would have guessed it, free will. Free will is that one attribute which allows for God to exist alongside evil. Now, this seems intuitively possible. Well, if God exists, let's say God and humans exist, then, well, humans being free has a choice to do good or to do evil. This seems to be quite a simple argument, right? If God exists, God's created humans with freedom. If God has given people with freedom, they have the choice to do good or evil. Therefore, a possible world in which God allows for humans to exist is a possible world in which evil exists. Hence, therefore, God can exist with evil through humans with free will. Now, that seems reasonable enough. Free will leads to evil. That seems to make sense. However, some people have argued, well, actually, it is possibly the case that, well, if God allows for humans to exist, why does he still allow for evil to exist? Surely he could make two scenarios. One, humans with free will, who only choose good all the time. And number two, why is humans with free will even important? If goodness was all that mattered, then, well, why not just create humans who do good all the time and are just robots? There's two responses to that. First response is that good or freedom is a higher order good. Now let me write higher order good, because this is a very important concept. Higher order good means that there are certain things in the hierarchy of values which are intrinsically bigger than others. A good example of this would be high orders of infinity. For example, there's not only one order of infinity, but numerous orders of infinity. The more high order you get, the more complex and bigger it is. But no matter how much you add to a certain level or order of those infinities, you don't actually get to the next level. So it's almost a completely cut off tier of different orders. So this will be tier 1, that's tier 2, and that's tier 3 and tier 4. And it's impossible for any value or any addition to go from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 to tier 4. You stay in your tier no matter how far you go up or down, or how much you add to them. So why is higher order goods important? Well, higher order goods important. It is important because it's there to try to explain why God just doesn't create human robots. Why doesn't he create people who do good all the time? Because according to Plantinga, it is possible, it doesn't need to be the case, but it's possible that free will is one of the higher order goods. So perhaps free will is a higher order good, and people being robots is not as high order good. Even if it's the case that free will plus some evil is perhaps has more evil than robots with only good. Since this is in an order in and of its own, it goes to show that, well, you see here, no matter how much good you add to robots and how much evil you add to the free will, you cannot break through these boundaries. So you're always going to be stuck with free will being more valuable than robots. Therefore, God cannot just create a world with robots who are all doing good, because that is not intrinsically based on this order of better good. Now, that's the response to people who say, well, why can't God just create robots? Now, let's think a bit about why can't God create people who are free but only do good all the time? As Christians, we know why this is the case, because of Adam and Eve. Now, people might just say, well, okay, I just don't accept Adam and Eve, but that's kind of irrelevant. I don't care what you accept. We know that humans have fallen and we're fallen, therefore our desires are messed up. And since our desires are messed up, it goes to show that, well, we're going to be choosing evil most of the time. Romans 8 says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. However, that's not the only reason. Plantinga suggests that there is another possible world in which a thing called transworld depravity exists. Now, of course, this is a sideway way of adding, a side form of adding the idea of Adam and Eve into it, but it's just saying, well, perhaps there is one possible world that every single being has a necessary property of doing evil things. Now, you may say that is highly improbable, But as I've said, it's a defense. We're not saying it must exist. All we need is one possible world. All we need is one possible world for which God to exist alongside evil, God and evil to coexist, for the free will defense to work. So as a result, if it's possible that transworld depravity works, then, well, it follows that it is possible for God and evil to exist. Likewise, if it's possible that free will is the highest order good, at least in one possible world, then it also shows it's possible for God and evil to exist. And that is the free will defense. I know it might be a bit complicated, but if you watch it a bit slower, you would see that when you're thinking about, is it possible for God and evil to exist, examples like transworld depravity and examples of higher order good of freedom make it seem, at least quite convincing to me, or quite reasonable to me, that it is possible, in one possible world, for God and evil to exist, because at the end of the day, there's nothing logically impossible with transworld depravity or either. Hello and welcome, guys. Today we're talking about the soul-building theodicy. Soul-building theodicy is one of the most influential theodicies in discussion surrounding the problem of evil, so I think it's very important that we discuss it in this series. As the name suggests, it is a theodicy, not a defense. And what that means is it is attempting to justify the ways of God to man. Why does God allow for evil? Well, the soul-building theodicist would be saying evil exists for soul building. So what actually is the soul-building theodicy? Philosophers who present this are people like Hick and Irenaeus, and they argue that evil exists, and this is a justification for why evil exists, is to move towards virtue. Now, virtue, I'm using it in a very loose term, virtue, moral goodness, and some other people would say, like Hick would say, it is heaven. So why would they say this? I'd like you to think about an example of maybe a vaccine, or maybe some trials or some struggles. In these situations, what have those situations led you towards? What's the purpose of the vaccine? For those who have done a bit of medicine before, you'll know that vaccine is there to put in dead bacteria or dead germs into your body so that you develop antibodies towards those sicknesses. It strengthens you through hurting you by forcing you to respond to those antibodies. Same way in James, the epistle of James, it talks about how we have to endure through trials and have patience through them, how we have to endure through struggling. And by going through these situations, these trials and these struggles, what we are allowed to do is to get strengthened. In the same way, the soul-building theodicy would say that evil is the same as these things, in the sense that evil is there, God allows evil to develop ourselves, to develop oneself. It is to help us understand what it means to be good Christians in the world. Now, what actually are we developing towards? Because it could be very easy to say, well, evil makes us better people. What's the point of being better people? People like Hick would say, well, the goal of all things is to go to heaven. Heaven is the ultimate goal for the soul-building theodicy. All evil points us towards God instead of away from Him. By recognizing God, by understanding God, by wrestling with the idea with God about why He allows evil, that wrestling would help us in the long term understand our faith, develop our virtues, and get closer to heaven. Now, this soul-building theodicy seems quite comprehensive, quite successful so far, but there are problems with it. Someone might respond by saying, well, all right, I get it. It does seem true that evil allows us to develop, it allows us to develop virtues. But we know in a Christian landscape, not everyone goes to heaven. In fact, we know that more people go to hell than go to heaven, and Jesus Himself was one of the biggest proponents of hell. He talks lots about hell in the Bible, so we cannot deny the fact that people go to hell. Well, what about hell? Now, there's a few ways people go around this. A few people would say, well, and this is what Hick says, which I think we as Christians deny. Hick says, well, actually, let's be universalists. Now, what does universalist mean? Well, universalist is the idea that everyone is going to go to heaven, everyone is safe. It's a universal salvation, hence why universalism is there. That's the significance of universalism. Some people say if everyone gets saved and there's no hell, everyone goes to heaven, everything works under that framework. But that's not something I really want to grant, because, well, we as Christians know that, as I said before, Jesus talks about hell, and Jesus teaches against universalism, so Jesus is correct. Then Hick is wrong. This is correct. Universalism is wrong.
That is undeniable. We cannot accept universalism if Jesus is correct. If that's the case, then, well, what do we do? Another person can say, and I think this is a possible solution for the so-called theodicy, and I think this is the correct one, is to say, well, in order for us to make decisions, right, when we're faced with good and bad, right, when we have to make good and bad choices, it's not just the choices that matter, but it's also the significance of those choices that matter. What is good and there's no consequences to doing good, and what's evil and there's no consequences to doing evil? And what I mean by consequences, I'm not talking about consequentialism. I'm not saying, well, this is good if X and Y and Z happen, or this is bad if A, B, and C happen. What I am saying is, well, I chose a good choice, and that good choice itself has a certain moral responsibility. If you've been enjoying this video so far and have found it helpful, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. If you want to support this channel financially and support our mission, then check out our Patreon in the link below, where you can support our channel there as well. Hope you enjoyed this video, and let's carry on. Now, if we get rid of hell, if we accept universalism, what is going to say, what we actually are saying is that duty or responsibility, what we're saying from universalism is duty is not related to a responsibility, or freedom is not related to responsibility. There is nothing out there to actually interact with. It just is the case that when we do good or we do evil, we're just moving towards somewhere, but it doesn't really matter, it's no significance. But if we say, yes, actually hell does exist, let's say hell and heaven exist, right? Heaven exists. What we're saying is that actually, when we make evil choices, we are pushing ourselves towards hell, and we're making good choices, we're pushing us towards heaven. What we're saying is a very Christian message by saying we do have a responsibility. Some people, yes, will go to hell, but that's because they've chosen to do evil, and evil is a morally responsible thing. God has given us evil and good so that we move towards the good, but at the same time, in order to move towards the good, inbuilt responsibility is necessary. And people might have problems with it, but I do think that this is a very comprehensive view when we're thinking about good and evil having responsibility, because ultimately, if it is true that God is wanting us to develop, giving us trials so that we develop and persevere through them, well then surely the trials can only make sense if there actually is a dynamic of good and evil and actually a moral responsibility that we are being drawn towards. And as a result, this is the soul building. Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're talking about the cosmic conflict theodicy. This is a bit of a lesser known theodicy, but it is presented by a guy called Peckham. Now we're going to be talking about the cosmic conflict theodicy today, which is a response to natural evil. The cosmic conflict, as the name suggests, goes on a different turn. It talks a bit more about, well, why does natural evil exist and why do things exist which don't seem to be explainable by absolutely anything? A philosopher called McCloskey has said in the past that, well, moral evil makes enough sense as it is. People have free will, whatever, they go kill people. Alright, within itself it seems to work, but at the same time, what about natural evil? It seems completely arbitrary. A rock falls on my head, I don't know why. Some tsunami randomly happens out of the blue. Surely God cannot allow that to happen. The cosmic conflict theodicy attempt is to reduce all evil to moral evil. All evil is moral evil. Now you can say, well, why is that the case? How can someone argue that all evil is moral evil, natural evil, or not? The word cosmic conflict in academia is to recognize spiritual dimensions as well. For example, in New Testament studies, the idea of cosmic conflict got to do with the relationship between Satan and Jesus. This is best seen in the Gospel of Luke, where it talks about Judas being entered into by Satan. Satan entered into him. Satan was deceiving him. In that sense, that's cosmic conflict. In the same way, cosmic conflict theology recognizes two dimensions in the world. There is two dimensions in the world, the physical and the spiritual. These two dimensions is a very important part of the cosmic conflict theology, because what it's saying is, well, not only does the physical exist, moral agents exist like humans, spiritual agents also exist. So what it's saying is, well, spiritual agents also exist alongside humans. Now, why might this affect our understanding of theodicy? What it is trying to argue, what is Peckham trying to argue, is that natural evil is a result of spiritual agents. Natural evil is caused by spiritual agents. Now, of course, atheists may say, well, I don't even accept God, why on earth am I accepting the existence of spiritual agents? That is irrelevant, because all problems of evils which are worthy of debate should be about internal consistency instead of external consistency. Therefore, as long as Christians accept the existence of spiritual agents, which is quite clear,
what these are angels and demons, which is clear throughout the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, what we know is that, well, if we accept the existence of angels and demons, which interact with the world, then in some sense, natural evil can be reduced to the moral evil of spiritual agents. Now, the evidence behind this, of the existence of spiritual agents, can be found in Peckham's book. I'll highly recommend you check it out, put a link to that in the description below. But you can see in the Old Testament, you have Gabriel, you have Michael, all them fighting against these spirituals of darkness, angels of darkness, like demons, and they are indeed impacting the natural world. So it is very, very important to think about it in that way. Now, how does that tie into everything? How do we tie this back to theosophy? Now that we've known that natural evil is about spiritual agents existing, we bring back the free will theodicy that we talked about, the free will theodicy and free will defense. In both situations, we notice that not all evil can be just said, well, okay, there's moral evil and there's natural evil, they can be separated. What it's saying is, well, all evil is moral evil. All evil is moral evil, since natural evil is a result of moral actions of spiritual agents. That means free will here has to do with free will of humans, but also free will of angels and demons. Since we accept the free will of angels and free will of demons, we can then turn and appeal back to our structures of the higher order goods, and also we can turn to our distinction of transfer depravity. Based on these two landscapes, we can once again suggest and see that since natural evil is a result of free will of angels, of demons, and moral evil is a result of free will of humans, then it follows that since free will is the highest order good, and also that all of us are morally flawed, then it follows that there is indeed not only a possible world in which God and evil coexist, both in the case of natural evil or moral evil. There is also a situation where God does justify the existence of both moral evil and natural evil as a result of higher goods of freedom, not only in the situation of humans, but also in the situation of demons. So I know this is quite confusing. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and I'll happily develop those arguments there with you. But I would once again like to direct you, if you have any more questions about the cosmic conflict theology, to think about Peckham's works, go check it out. Yeah, he wrote a really, really wonderful book, which I'll highly recommend you to go check it out.
Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're going to be talking about the Theodicy of Mystery, which is one of the responses that a theist can have in response to the problem of evil. Today we're going to be talking a few areas and elements surrounding the Theodicy of Mystery, and we're also going to be talking about some possible developments and implications of this theodicy. Now, what I like about the Theodicy of Mystery is that instead of trying to purely use reason and philosophy to try to create a possible world in which God and evil exist, as you can see in the free will defense, what the Theodicy of Mystery is trying to do is to start from the Bible. For example, we're going to be talking a lot about the book of Job, and also look at Christian sources like Dostoevsky, and we're going to see from how a Christian perspective, purely from the Bible, can we respond to the problem of evil. Now, of course, there are going to be some shortcomings, which we will be discussing it later when we touch upon skeptical theism. Nevertheless, it is a very important theodicy, and I can't wait to share it with you. So, what is the Theodicy of Mystery? Theodicy of Mystery has kind of two strands to it. On one hand, there's a more strictly philosophical hand, and on the other hand, it's more of an existential discussion. On the philosophical side of things, the Theodicy of Mystery is saying, well, we do not have sufficient evidence to make a claim about any of the variables within the argument. So, for example, when the logical problem of evil says, well, okay, God is good, or God is evil, or God is all-powerful, whatever these attributes are, what the Theodicy of Mystery is saying, well, okay, we cannot actually claim what those variables are. We do not know exactly what these variables are, and a result, since we do not know what the variables are, philosophically speaking, the atheist has the burden of proof to demonstrate what those are, but since he cannot, because of course the argument and idea from mystery is that we cannot know what these things are, therefore the argument fails philosophically, because when the atheist is saying, well, okay, God cannot exist because I believe God is X, Y, and Z, and evil exists, there's some contradiction there, if you say, well, all right, try to define your terms and they can't define it, they can't determine what God is, then their argument is not strong. For example, if I said, well, the sky is red and I cannot define what the sky is red, I have not made a very good argument either. But of course, there's also a very existential element to the Theodicy of Mystery, which is saying that, well, the phenomena of evil, when we're wrestling with the idea of evil in the world, what we're talking about is not just the idea that, okay, there's a philosophical application to the idea of evil, but rather when we're talking about evil in the world, we're talking about a true phenomena that no matter how much we try to rationalize it, there is still an element of mystery to that evil, and that no possible reasons and ideas can possibly rationalize and synthesize and make us understand and truly realize why evil exists. And in some sense, that's an existential point, because you're saying, well, all right, evil exists, I exist in relation to evil. How can I wrestle with the question of evil, which is a question of existentialism and is not a question of pure philosophy. So we have a broad view of what the Theodicy of Mystery is trying to do. So let us elaborate it by looking at a few forms of thought in relationship to the Theodicy of Mystery. So the first thing that we're going to be talking about is apophatic theology. Now, apophatic theology is in response to, or in contrast to, cataphatic philosophy, which is positive philosophy. So apophatic being negative, this is thinkers like Via Negativa, this is like Dionysius the Areographite. I've completely butchered that name, but what is this is trying to say? It is trying to describe God via negative proclamation. So according to students of apophatic theology, and most of these are Russian Orthodox theologians, because the West quite like the positive proclamations of God. God is good, God is strong, God is all-powerful. What apophaticism is saying is, well, God is not evil, God is not bad, God is not all-powerful. So when you're thinking about these ideas, so they're using the negative or double negatives to affirm God's properties, what apophatic theology is demonstrating is that, well, although we can try to get towards what God is, we can only do that via understanding what God is not. So although definitionally we do not understand exactly God is X, Y, or Z, what we can say is, well, okay, this is the set of all possible descriptions of someone. If we cut out everything else, let's cut out everything else, we get at least a better idea of what this is. Maybe we do not know exactly what it is, but at least we start to have an understanding of what it is like. So that is the idea of apophatic theology, especially seen in Eastern philosophy, and as a result, those roots are trying to help us get us closer to God. And if you accept apophatic theology, then you're almost dedicated, or you're almost committed to a form of skeptical theism, or a term, or the Theodicy of Mystery, because then you could just say to the atheist or the challenger that, well, yes, we understand that there's a very strong point of evil in the world, but unfortunately for your philosophical argument, and this is purely from a philosophical perspective, you are unable to sustain, or you're unable to defend your arguments of what God is and what those properties exactly are to be in contradiction to evil. So as a result, by using apophatic theology, by using the negative, you in some sense are able to defeat the structural presentation of the problem of evil. Now that we've talked about apophatic theology, let's talk about skeptical theism. Now, skeptical theism is very similar to apophatic theology in the sense that skeptical theism also stems from the idea that we cannot fully understand God. So there's this epistemic distance between us and God. So if we are here, our knowledge of God, which is here, and is limited. So although we can understand a bit, you can see here I've drawn some breaks in that line just to say that while we might understand a bit of God, we don't know fully about the God's plans, God's ideas, who God is. And as a result, when we are claiming, or when an atheist is claiming, well, all right, there are certain elements of Christianity which are in contradiction to evil, or evil makes certain elements of Christianity improbable, well, you could just say, well, actually, we do not have enough evidence on our hands to actually make a proper decision about this situation. So skeptical theism would suggest that we just do not know or have enough information to make a claim in favor or against the existence of God. Now that we've talked a bit about apophatic theology and skeptical theism, let us turn towards the biblical evidence for the Theodicy of Mystery. And I think this is the area where the Theodicy of Mystery is the strongest, because this is the area in which we're relying purely on the Bible. Because at the end of the day, the problem of evil is a challenge of internal consistency. How can we understand the existence of evil in relationship to the Christian claims? The Christian claims, according to the theist, that God is good, all-powerful, and all these things. The Christian also claims that evil exists. The problem of evil is saying, well, that idea, that those sets of propositions are very unlikely. However, if we're turning back to our understanding of the Bible, well, we could say, well, okay, we say God is good, perhaps, but that good can only be contextualized within the framework of the Bible. So, for example, when we say God is good or God is all-powerful, these claims of good and all-powerful must be seen in relationship to other phenomena within the Bible. And the best example is the book of Job. So no matter how we try to represent God as being good or God is all-powerful, those definitions, how we define good and how we define all-powerful, it must be in line and must be aware of our understanding of the book of Job. And what we see in the book of Job, and I wouldn't go in depth into it, but what we see in the book of Job is a situation where God is allowing the devil to make Job suffer. He almost in some sense tortures Job to allow his own name to be praised in the relationship to the devil. Now, of course, it's not really God doing the torturing, but God allows the devil to torture him. And as a result, when you're thinking about God, good and all-powerful, we very soon realize that a God which allows the things to happen to Job is very different from the conception of goodness and all-powerful that we use or see in the modern world we have today. And as a result, when we're thinking about, well, okay, what are those properties which are actually in contradiction to evil, we understand that good and all-powerful can only be limited to the understanding of good and all-powerful in relation to the book of Job. And when we actually open the Bible and look at the book of Job, if you turn to Job chapter 40, verse 2, you say, "Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him." And then Job answered the Lord in verse 3 and verse 4, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more." Now, what that seems to suggest is that when we're thinking about the idea of the book of Job, what we're seeing is God himself is providing a theodicy of mystery. Because if you think about what God was just saying, God was saying, well, hey, look, Job, I know you suffered a lot, but can you answer me why I did that? Can you tell me of my plans to Job? And Job is just saying, well, I seriously cannot. In all honesty, I cannot provide a theodicy of knowledge. I'm providing a theodicy of mystery. I do not know. And as a result, Job responds to the problem of evil placed by God with the theodicy of mystery. So we understand that within the biblical landscape, the theodicy of mystery is a very strong element of this discussion. Now that we've talked a bit about the theodicy of mystery in relation to Job, let's talk about the theodicy of mystery vis-a-vis Dostoevsky. And this is best seen within Ivan's mutiny or rebellion, depending on translation, in the Brothers Karamazov. And what we see here, and why I called it that Dostoevsky is also using the theodicy of mystery, is not only because Dostoevsky was heavily reliant on Job, so there was a lot of influence between those two thinkers, but it was also because of Ivan Karamazov's claims and constant recollections and proclamations that, well, all right, God, I really don't know why you've allowed all these suffering to happen to children. Because you need to remember that Ivan Karamazov's problem of evil is not that he's saying, well, okay, I don't believe God exists because God is logically inconsistent with evil. He is saying, well, regardless of whether there's a God or not, what the evil that is being suffered is completely inexplicable. It's absurd. I have no understanding about why this evil exists. And it's almost this cry to desperation to God of why do you allow evil to happen to children? And in many senses, Dostoevsky doesn't answer that directly. He's not trying to provide a suggestion or a solution to that challenge. He's just saying, well, there is a mystery. I don't understand what's going on, but there is a response. There is a mystery. And Zosima in the story once again refers to Job, so there is that connection there, as I've said previously. So now that we've thought about different approaches to the theodicy of mystery from the lens of skeptical theism, apophatic theology, Job, and Dostoevsky, I would like to talk a bit about possible challenges to the theodicy of mystery. So now these are two main challenges that you might come across. Of course, there may be more, depending on who you're talking to, but these are the two main challenges. The first thing is that it doesn't actually respond to the problem of evil. Now, why might someone say this challenge? Well, someone might take this challenge because they might feel that since you're saying, well, okay, there isn't an actual reason for why God and evil coexist, they might feel that you haven't responded to their objection. And in some sense, they're right. And the reason why they're right is because when they're making the problem of evil and when they're making this challenge, they're presupposing that there already is a seeming inconsistency between God and evil. So they assume, and I'll just use some like kind of wiggly lines to demonstrate or signify inconsistency here, but from their perspective, they already established that there is some inconsistency between God and evil, and as a result, they're expecting you to do kind of like the soul-building theology or the free will defense to demonstrate how God and evil can coexist together in a straight line. I'll just use that to signify coexisting. So in some sense, they're expecting you to use a theodicy, a traditional theodicy, to find that coexistence. However, as we've said before, what you're trying to do with the Theodicy of Mystery is not say, okay, there actually is some reason for why God and evil coexist. What we're trying to say is, well, actually, hold up a second, you cannot even make this assumption. Your fundamental assumption of the problem of evil does not stand. Why? Because, well, you cannot even define what God is, and if you cannot define one of your variables, you cannot have a valid argument. And just a way to think about it is, well, you have a valid argument if you have, perhaps, if X, then Y, and then X, therefore Y, right? That's a valid argument. However, the challenge then arises is, well, what if you just make this undefined? Let's have a question there. We do not know what this is. Then no matter what you try to do, although the structure is valid, the argument is not sound, and you cannot make a sound argument based off these undefined variables. And as the same way, if you're making the Theodicy of Mystery, if you're challenging their problem of evil, you're saying that, well, God is in some sense not knowable. You cannot know what God is, and if that's the case, then they cannot make a sound argument. Now, apart from the challenge that the Theodicy of Mystery doesn't respond to the problem of evil, you can also talk about why people might challenge that it is not convincing. Now, some people would say that the Theodicy of Mystery is not convincing because really it only kind of responds to the theistic structure. It's not going to make an atheist who's suffered evil to think, well, actually, well, what am I meant to do with evil? I still feel there's an inconsistency between God and evil. So what would you do in that position? Well, I think there's two things you can do. Firstly, you can turn back to, and this is why I made previous videos on the soul-building theology, the free will defense, and the cosmic conflict theology, you can return to arguments and reasons for why these are not inconsistent. Now, of course, you can return by doing that. So if it's not convincing, you can turn to arguments for that, like the free will defense and soul-building theology. But you could also say that, well, actually, hold up a second. The entire project, and we'll talk about this in the next video when we're talking about anti-theodicies, but we can say, well, hold up, the whole project of the problem of evil is flawed. What you're trying to say is, well, philosophy and reason can explain the totality of the problem of evil. But the reality is, evil is a very diverse, it's a very deep and a strong problem. And as a result, by saying, well, okay, well, these things aren't fully answering the problem, well, you know what? We cannot expect to fully understand the problem of evil. But the question is, well, what worldview can best respond to evil? What's the best worldview which can respond to the challenge of suffering and evil in the world? And if we maintain that it is the Christian worldview, then you understand that even if it may not be convincing per se to the atheist who's saying, well, I believe there's inconsistency here, it could be convincing to other Christians and also to honest atheists who are saying, well, actually, let's take a step back from the philosophical problem of evil because we've already demonstrated there is some problems with it, and say, well, actually, maybe my presuppositions are incorrect and maybe a Christian worldview is the way to go. In today's video, we're going to be talking about anti-theodicy. This is going to wrap up our series on the problem of evil and is a very unique and new formulation in recent literature about the problem of evil. The question of anti-theodicy is presented by thinkers like Nick Trakakis, Kenneth Surin, and more, who argue, instead of saying, well, there is some problem with the theodicy, so they don't look at the free will defense and object to that, or look at the soul-building theodicy and object to that, but rather what they're trying to say is, well, the very act of making a theodicy is itself problematic. So they're thinking like, well, actually, hold up a second. Why should we bother responding to theodicies when we could just get rid of the entire act of a theodicy itself? So we're going to dive into what anti-theodicy is in this video, so hope you enjoy. On the board, you'll see the 4 areas of anti-theodicy that I'll be talking about today. First of all, we're going to be talking about 3 elements of the anti-theodical movement, and then I'll talk about transitivity, which is what I believe the theistic response to anti-theodicy. So first of all, the most important conception that you should have about anti-theodicy is that it is attempting to bridge the gap between the practical and conceptual discussions surrounding the problem of evil. When approaching the problem of evil, there has historically been a recognition of the pastoral or existential problem of evil that we've discussed previously in this series, and the conceptual problem of evil, which is, well, what are the philosophical abstract reasoning behind the potentiality or possibility of God's existence alongside evil. Now, what the anti-theodicist is trying to argue is that, well, actually, the distinction between the conceptual and practical is a superficial one and a problematic one. So their argument is, well, we should not have this distinction between the conceptual and the practical, but rather combined both of these elements, the pastoral and the philosophical one, purely because every single application or presentation of a conceptual argument has its practical implications. For example, if someone is arguing for the problem of evil, it is very difficult to fully separate oneself from the examples of evil that they use. When someone raises rape or when someone raises Holocaust or whatever it is, they find it very difficult to separate themselves from this fact. And in a similar way, when you're thinking about, well, actually, hold up a second, what are these things? Well, the reality is, since you cannot separate yourself between the conceptual and the practical, the anti-theodicists like Trakakis and Surin would be arguing that, well, okay, let's get rid of this distinction. This is one and the same. So that is the fundamental premise of anti-theodicy. So if we grant this premise of anti-theodicy, well, where does that leave us? The argument that the anti-theodicists are presenting is that this leads to a moral challenge of theodicies. And what I mean by a moral challenge of theodicies is that the theodicy itself, the act of making a theodicy itself, is morally problematic. So instead of going and saying, well, okay, let us discuss this from a conceptual landscape as I've discussed previously, well, how about, let's just say, well, practically speaking, the morality of theodicy is bad. So this is a very bad idea. To talk about theodicies and the problem of evil from a purely conceptual framework leads to, one, trivializing evil, as I'm going to talk about a bit later, and it leads to one to fall into the trap of moral corruption. Now, of course, that's a very big claim. On what basis do we measure whether someone is morally corrupt or there is some moral issue there as well? Well, I suppose the broadest appeal that they have is an appeal to intuition. They're arguing that, saying, well, actually, to try to use a philosophical conceptual framework to describe and argue about the reason for why God allows evil is to get rid of all the existential, practical, and phenomenological dimensions of the existence of evil. And as a result, it leads to the trivialization of evil. Because evil isn't something which can purely be talked about in a conceptual landscape. Evil is something which is existential. It's something which is very real. It's something that we all wrestle and take part in. When we're stepping into that shoes of someone who is suffering, we understand that evil is a real phenomena that they experience, and to purely say, well, maybe there is some conceptual justification for that evil, will be to diminish the evil that they're experiencing and not provide a sufficient response to the problem of evil. Now, the position of the anti-theodicists seems to be quite strong. We seem to be accepting that, well, okay, conceptual treatment of the problem of evil does indeed trivialize evil. And also, we seem to accept that there is some moral problems of theodicy itself. Now, where does this leave the theist? The anti-theodicist will say, well, okay, the problem of evil is unanswerable. However, I object to this presentation. In fact, I'm developing this argument in a current paper that I'm trying to publish, is that, well, actually, instead of saying the anti-theodical charge can only be applied to the conceptual theodicies, it can also be applied to conceptual problems of evils. So hence why I call it a transitivity principle. Not only is the charge, okay, if we think about the charge, this is a charge against theodicy, I argue that this is also a charge against the problem of evil. And since the principle of transitivity says, well, if x then y, and then y then z, then x then z, you then get the same idea that if the anti-theodical charge is applicable to theodicies, and it is true that it is a transitive relation, then, well, the morality of a theodicy being problematic and the trivialization of evil is not only applicable to the theodicies, but also conceptual formulations of the problem of evil. Now, that seems to be quite clear. If we're analyzing the conceptual problem, presentations of the problem of evil, we soon are we soon understand and we soon know that, well, actually, what we are wrestling here is not just a problem on the side of the theist, but also on the side of the atheist as well. Perhaps what the Anti-Theodicy is trying to demonstrate is not only that theodicies are a flawed project to begin with, but that problem of evil in a purely conceptual way is also a flawed project to begin with. To elaborate upon this distinction, I would like to raise an example from a book called Sophie's Choice by William Styron. So it's Sophie's Choice. And essentially what happens in this book is that you have a soldier, a Jewish woman, who is subject to Holocaust and is forced to choose between whether her son or her daughter gets sent to the gas chambers. She is put in an enviable position and is forced to make a choice, and then she just falls into deep depression afterwards. This is a great example of evil. Now the anti-theodicists love using this example because what they're arguing is, well, how can you possibly use a conceptual theodicy to describe her situation, to say, well, okay, your suffering was made for a purely future good, or perhaps that the free will of the soldiers, the Nazi soldiers, was an intrinsically good event. Now, the reality and the sadness of the situation is, I argue that the anti-theodicists miss the point, because what they're objecting is not the treatment of evil per se in relation to theodicy, but what we're truly wanting to discuss is a trivialization of evil per se. So when we're talking about trivializing evil, let's realize that not only is this Sophie's Choice situation providing a problem for theoretical theodicy, it's also providing a problem for theoretical problems of evils. Because if you're going to apply Sophie's Choice to the logical problem of evil, the LPOE, or you're going to apply it to the evidential problem of evil, the EPOE, you're going to notice that they're both using evil as the variable in the argument. They're just both using, let's say, evil is X, and then they're basically just going to say evil is X, X is inconsistent with God, so it's not consistent with God. And then basically what they've done is purely reduce Sophie's Choice to a mere variable, and as an extension of that, trivializing evil. And due to this demonstration, I would argue that it's very clear that although the anti-theodical charge does make a lot of sense and is indeed a strong argument against intrinsic structures and assumptions of theodicies, it is also very much applicable to the act of providing theoretical problem of evils as well. So that wraps up our discussion on anti-theodicy and our series on the problem of evil. I hope you've learned some new things during this series, and also that the ideas found within are edifying and helpful in your intellectual development. And also a huge thank you has to go to all the Patreons who support me financially to help this channel continuously be run. It is my goal to make the best philosophy and theology content on the internet and provide it in an accessible and affordable fashion. So make sure to support the channel either on Patreon or by liking and subscribing and sharing these videos with your friends. Stay safe, see you soon, thank you for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you next one.